Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andy Weir, author of The Martian.
Pretty cool. Hey, everybody. Well, I'm just here to introduce Buzz. You came here to see him, not me, but he once traveled 250,000 miles to get to the moon. So I'm curious, who here traveled at least 50 miles to be here today? Raise your hands. All right. Who here drove at least 100 miles? Raise your hands. All right. Did anybody drive over 200 miles to get here? All right, guys. It's Happy Earth Day. I know you're not here to see me, so I'm not going to talk here. I'm just going to say Buzz is a great guy. He's one of my good friends. Whenever we're in the same city, we try to get together. He's a fantastic man. You're going to enjoy his talk, ladies and gentlemen. Colonel and Dr. Buzz Aldrin.
You hear me okay? Yeah, please sit down. Good afternoon, and thank you for having me to the second annual Silicon Valley Comic-Con. Do we have any geeks in the house? They're all down here, none of them are up there? Okay. I guess I could be considered a geek, maybe a space geek, and golly, I'm shooting for the moon again, but this time it's to lead us to Mars. But we've got to do it together this time, in cooperation with other nations. The world does a better job of big endeavors when we work together. Timing is very important. Always been a very significant part of my life, because I am proud to have served my country, and I will continue to do so. I've served the U.S. Air Force and the Apollo program. The Apollo program could never have happened without the cooperation and efforts of many people working together toward a common shared goal. And when people work together, sometimes you can accomplish the impossible. Consider this. We do have slides, maybe? Yeah, all right. I can see it here, but all right. So you can see it too. All right, now they told me about it. Mankind has always dreamed for centuries of reaching space, other planets, even the stars. But it wasn't until the 20th century that man took to the air. In 1903, the Wright brothers took their first flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. My mother was born that same year, and I guess you could say that pioneering was my destiny. You see, her maiden name was Marion Moon. And I took my first flight at age 2 with my father, Edwin Eugene Aldrin. And it was in a Lockheed single-engine Lockheed Vega, and it was painted to look like an eagle. How about that? The symbol of our country and the name of our spacecraft landed on the moon. Now, surrounded by this influence of aviation, I entered the Air Force after graduating from the military academy at West Point. I was in the Korean War as a jet fighter pilot. I flew 66 combat missions. Following the Korean War, I was stationed in Germany in the late 50s. The Cold War was accelerating. The tensions were high. In October 1957, the Soviet Union pulled off a very sudden and unexpected technological feat. They launched beep, 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 Sputnik into orbit. And a year later, America formed the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. With the goal of reaching space. So the space age was formed, and the space race was about to begin. In 1961, NASA launched America's first Mercury astronaut, Alan Shepard, on a 15-minute suborbital flight that touched the edge of space. Now, the Russians had already achieved an incredible accomplishment by sending the first human into space, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, one full orbit around the Earth. President Kennedy asked NASA what is possible. They told him that it would take 15 years before we could put a man on the moon. I recently learned, however, at 100th anniversary of the MIT Aero-Astro Department, that Kennedy visited NASA and asked the engineers to figure out how to get to Mars. So they worked over a weekend and came back with the answer. It was just a little bit too hard. The moon might be a more realistic goal. Now that probably was the busiest weekend that NASA ever has spent. Can you imagine one weekend to do that? So on May 25th, 1961, 3 weeks after Alan Shepard's flight, President Kennedy boldly challenged America to commit to the goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. We hadn't even put anyone in orbit. The rockets and spacecraft just really didn't exist. And many thought this challenge was going to be impossible. We just didn't seem to have the know-how. But we did have a leader with the vision, the determination, the courage, and the confidence that we could get there. By publicly stating our goal, putting a specific time period on this specific achievement, President Kennedy gave us no way out. Yeah, we didn't have the best plan, but we did develop it a little later. Now, if space was going to be our next frontier, then I wanted to be a part of getting there. So I decided to continue my education and receive my doctorate in astronautics from MIT. Now, heck with a master's degree, just go right for a doctorate. For my thesis, I devised a technique for two spacecraft to join up in orbit called manned orbital rendezvous, sort of patterned after intercepting another airplane in atmosphere. Little did anyone know, including me, how critical this work would be to our later successfully landing on the moon and coming back, because we had to rendezvous to get back. Now, the first time I applied to be a NASA astronaut, I was turned down because I hadn't gone to test pilot training in my plans. Somehow I just didn't think that was really necessary. So that was it, but I was determined and I applied again. Now, this time, my fighter experience in combat and NASA's interest in the concept I had for space rendezvous influenced them to accept me in the third group of astronauts. And I became known among my peers, Navy, Marines, and Air Force, as Dr. Rendezvous. Now, it wasn't always a complimentary description. But you know these guys, they try and poke fun at you. Mercury was the first stage of our space program, followed by the Gemini program. And it's correct to call it Gemini or Gemini, but they're both in the dictionary, the one I read anyway. Now, this two-man spacecraft was used to fill the gap as the rockets were being developed for Apollo. Took a while. So Gemini became an integral part of our training, and it helped us learn to do things like spacewalking, long-duration flight, computer entry, and, of course, rendezvous. Now,